Springlock technology, a brilliant invention or reckless display of pride. Today I'll be explaining the history of Springlock suits throughout multiple continuities, including uncovering the origin of two of the series' most mysterious suits, and finally solving one of FNaF 3's greatest mysteries. Make sure to watch through to the end for the full story. Let's uncover the mystery of Springlocks. According to the games and the Silver Eyes, Springlocks were invented almost as early as the first restaurant. Security Breach brought us several vintage posters from this restaurant, Fredbear's Family Diner, which seemed to show a time before Springlock suits were mainstream. Here, Fredbear wears black accessories like Golden Freddy, and Spring Bonnie seems to be in a style similar to Glitch Trap, a fabric mascot suit. Based on this, we can assume that Springlocks weren't invented or at least weren't used in the restaurants at this time. In the Silver Eyes, Charlie tells John about this vintage restaurant, saying the animals weren't always robots, the bear and the bunny were costumes. We learned that before the costumes were filled with animatronic parts, Henry used to put them onto robots when they weren't being worn by performers, something the Springlock suits would later simplify. Eventually, Fredbear's Family Diner incorporated Springlock technology, Henry's way of streamlining the costumes, allowing them to either be worn by performers or operated independently as animatronics. These new suits promptly replaced their old predecessors, being everything the original costumes were and more. To be more specific, Charlie describes Spring Bonnie as a patchwork, ragged yellow rabbit suit, which indicates that the old costumes were upgraded with the new Springlock technology rather than replaced by entirely new costumes. We know this is possible because Henry would occasionally put these costumes onto robots, and the new suits functioned in essentially the same way. Furthermore, upgrading old mascots is a familiar theme throughout the story. The withered animatronics from FNaF 2 were initially being upgraded with new technology, the same way I believe these original costumes were. This also fits Charlie's description of Henry, extremely pragmatic and resourceful. Technically, these early Springlock suits were the first form of animatronics in any of the restaurants. As mentioned, Henry did occasionally put the original costumes onto dancing robots, but as far as dedicated animatronics, these were the first freestanding examples. However, these were not the first Springlock suits. The Silver Eyes describes one of the first Springlock suits Henry made, a blue animal character with a cardioid-shaped chest and two buttons. The origins of the suit are pretty mysterious. We know that it was one of Henry's first Springlock costumes, but we don't know what its purpose was. This is a character that Charlie does not recognize and is described as looking unlike any specific type of animal. I believe that this is a very old suit. In the Silver Eyes graphic novel, we see one of these early Springlock suits, a character with several extremely unique design features. The face features accented cheeks unlike any other animatronics of its time and has two buttons on its torso, a characteristic only on the characters at Fredbear's Family Diner and left out when Freddy and his friends were created, at least in the novels. The novels mention that the children preferred realistic looking characters, the way they acted when Henry and William were wearing them rather than when they were brought to life by robotics. Of course, their appearance had to mimic this realism, which the classic costumes being made of fuzzy fur-like fabric did well. Henry's first Springlock suits were completely the opposite. These characters were animal-like but sort of uncanny in that you couldn't really tell what they were supposed to be. Henry had made successful animal mascots before developing Springlocks, but the first suits using this new technology were stylistically primitive. I believe that these characters were some of Henry's first designs before Fredbear and Spring Bonnie were even conceptualized. In the Silver Eyes, Carlton is trapped in a back room full of what he describes as furry piles of fabric, later identified as empty costumes, mascots for the restaurant. Two of these are Springlock suits, the once bright blue one that Carlton is trapped in, and another fuzzy green one. The novel describes these costumes as looking as if someone had been told make an animal and had done just that, careful not to make it look like any specific type of animal. I don't believe this was Henry trying not to create a specific animal, but rather him developing his first mascot and trying to find a style that he liked. Given that their colors and descriptions don't match any characters we're familiar with, and with Charlie being unsure of what they're supposed to be, saying not everything he built made it to the stage, it's very possible that these were not only Henry's first Springlock suits, but his very first characters. Before coming up with the idea of two yellow characters, Henry was creating his first mascot costumes, unsure of how he wanted them to look. His first two mascots were ambiguous, sort of resembling animals, but not so much so that they were identifiable. Eventually, he realized that his characters had to be recognizable, animals that children would know and grow fond of. After a few failed attempts, Henry created two mascots that he liked, a yellow bear and a matching yellow rabbit. These characters became the faces of Henry's first restaurant, Fredbear's Family Diner, a diner he opened with his business partner William Afton. For a while, the costumes worked. Henry and William would wear them and dance around on stage, but eventually this became impractical. Henry wanted to socialize with the parents in the restaurant as well as entertain the children, so he developed robots that were about the same size as a human. These would operate the mascots when he or William were too busy to. Of course, this worked fine and Henry was able to entertain parents and children all at the same time, but he was never satisfied. Henry had a dream where his mascots could be both costume and animatronic, rather than one or the other. With this idea, he began developing Springlocks, devices that would compress the internal parts of an animatronic against the sides of its suit so that a person could fit inside. This would allow Henry and William to quickly jump into a suit when they needed to seamlessly insert themselves into a performance. At first, Henry developed models using this new technology that were too temperamental for the restaurant. Being resourceful, Henry decided to use his old mascot prototypes to build the first Springlock suits, as it wouldn't make sense to test this new experimental technology on suits he was currently using, and he was looking for a way to repurpose that old fabric anyway. One of these may have been a suit that William tested, given his horrible scars that were caused by a Springlock failure. Eventually, Henry had a working model of a Springlock suit that he replicated and finished using the mascot costumes from the diner. The old failed models went into storage until Henry could find a way to repurpose them. I believe these suits went unused for a few years before they finally found a purpose. In FNaF 3's training cassettes from a very vintage Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, we hear mention of temporary costumes. After the Springlock suits were deemed unsafe and were retired, management provided their performers with temporary costumes that were found on very short notice and, according to their description, were probably not appropriate nor relevant to the restaurant. From what we see in the Silver Eyes, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza not only stored a ton of extra costumes, but specifically the original Springlock prototypes. Considering that these weren't specific to any type of animal and have bright colors and outdated designs, these costumes would absolutely fit the description of inappropriate and irrelevant. Plus, the novel draws attention to specifically two old Springlock suits, a bright blue one and a fuzzy green one, which is exactly how many they'd need to temporarily replace the two retired suits, Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. While moving the retired suits into a safe room, management noticed two unutilized suits sitting in the corner and decided to salvage their vintage costumes for their performers to wear while the classic suits were being looked at by technicians. These costumes would have been taken off of their Springlock endoskeletons, which couldn't have been done to Fredbear and Spring Bonnie since their technicians had to assess them. Now, we know that Henry made the Springlock suits we see throughout the games, and even though they're considered highly unstable, they're regularly used in all of the restaurants until being banned. In the Silver Eyes, Henry shows a Springlock to a young Charlie, saying it's very dangerous and that it's very easy to trigger them if a person doesn't know what they're doing. This lines up with the FNaF 3 training cassettes, where Phone Guy provides new employees with what he calls much needed information on how to operate these suits. This explains why Henry promoted the use of these suits, knowing how dangerous they were. He considered them to be harmless as long as the proper safety protocols were followed. Of course, Phone Guy makes the suit sound extremely impractical, but that's mostly his personality.
I'm not implying that they died. That's not what I meant. Anyway.
Throughout all of their history, we only hear of one actual instance of these suits malfunctioning, and it's not the bite of 83. In that incident, a customer's head was lodged into a singing animatronic's mouth, so we can't really blame Springlocks for that one. However, we do hear of an incident that occurred at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's sister location that involved multiple Springlock failures, which caused the suits to be deemed unfit for employees to use. Unfortunately, we don't know much about what this incident was. It could have been William's near-death experience that's described in the Silver Eyes, or something involving that vintage Springlock suit from Circus Baby's old restaurant. But that suit was allegedly never used, and we don't have any evidence that William's close encounter ever happened in the game's continuity. As mentioned, Circus Baby's old restaurant had a Springlock suit, but it was never used because it was too dangerous. We know that William created the Funtime animatronics for that restaurant, but Springlocks were Henry's invention. So who made this old Springlock suit? One of the suit's defining features is its faceplates, a feature that only Afton's Funtime animatronics have. So is it possible that this isn't one of Henry's first Springlocks, but rather one of William's? Let's look at some of his animatronics. In the blueprints for the Funtime animatronics, two of them have cavities in their stomachs for children to be held in, as shown in Funtime Freddy's illustration. Springlock suits are known for being able to function as both an animatronic and a suit for one person to fit inside. Circus Baby even emphasizes that this Springlock suit is big enough for a person to fit into, but just barely. As far as we know, Henry's suits were not like this. When Carlton wakes up in one of Henry's suits, he has metal poking into him from the framework of the suit, but he's also shoved into the torso with his arms pinned against his sides rather than in the arms of the suit. So Carlton is able to fit into one of Henry's first prototypes even with his arms against his sides. But this suit from Circus Baby's old restaurant can hardly fit Michael, who's able to use his arms to keep the suit's Springlocks wound. So this doesn't seem to be one of Henry's creations, but rather William's first prototype of an animatronic that could capture children. Circus Baby tells us that this suit came from her old pizzeria, but she doesn't believe it was ever used, at least not in the way it was meant to be used. Similarly, Henry's first Springlocks were never used. They were failed prototypes, but they were intended to be used as costumes. In the insanity-ending speech from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria simulator, Henry says, "As if the suffering wasn't enough. Small souls trapped in prisons of my making, now set to new purpose." While this line could be interpreted in several different ways, it fits the description of William using one of Henry's suits to encapsulate children, trapping them in prisons that Henry had made, but used in a way that he had not anticipated. Circus Baby also supports this idea, saying that the suit was never used, or at least not how it was meant to be used. Being Henry's failed prototype, this suit would never have been officially used until William got his hands on it and turned it into something completely different than what it was designed for. Furthermore, the fourth closet almost perfectly parallels this idea. Circus Baby, a robot that William stole from Henry, describes killing Elizabeth as doing what she was built to do. In the novels, we know that this robot was not initially built to kill. It was meant to emulate the daughter of a grieving father. Furthermore, Henry never planned on using this robot. He buried it after realizing that he'd gone too far. Like in these novels, I believe William stole an animatronic that Henry never planned on using and repurposed it for capturing children. In the Twisted ones, the Twisted animatronics are described in a similar way to Henry's first Springlock suits, having the appearance of an animal but not so much so that you could guess what it was supposed to be. This characteristic is attributed to William, as Charlie says the internals of these animatronics look like her father's work, but pointing at its head, someone else may have had a hand in it. It's hard to completely attribute this quality to William since these animatronics are made of metal and plastic, while the anthropomorphic Springlock suits were made of fabric, something Henry is known for. However, Charlie also notices that their hardware is old technology, saying that Henry may have made it earlier than she would remember, which could characterize this quality by era rather than creator. This makes a lot more sense since Henry's early suits were made of fur while the Twisted ones were made of metal and plastic, with long straight splits running down their faces, similar to the faceplates on William's Funtime animatronics. It's also interesting that one of Henry's first Springlock suits was once a bright blue, now faded to a dull blue approximation of beige, and while the books describe it as non-specific in appearance, the graphic novels illustrate a bear with accented cheeks. These are all characteristics shared with Twisted Freddy, who is shown as a bluish bear with accented cheeks. This further emphasizes that William was stealing Henry's work, ripping off his style and even stealing his animatronics. That explains why the Twisted animatronics internals are made of old technology associated with Henry, but their exteriors are modern and feature William's illusion disc technology. One of these animatronics even captures Charlie in its belly and holds her arms and legs in place using Springlocks. I believe this is exactly how the Springlock suit from Circus Baby's old restaurant was used, to capture children. In hindsight, were Springlocks destined to fail? Was it Henry's constant need to outdo himself that allowed this reckless endeavor to become a reality? While it seems like William and Henry were once copacetic business partners, there are definitely hints throughout the story that they each felt challenged by one another, which may have led Henry into carelessness and William into insanity. One thing that's always puzzled me is why Henry promotes the use of his Springlock suits. He clearly knows how dangerous they are. With William developing his own animatronics, which he boasts aren't as poorly designed as Henry's, there was clearly some competition between the company's owners. While Henry's Springlocks were meant to make both his and William's lives easier, was this invention also a sly attempt to humble his arrogant apprentice? Perhaps that's something to explore in a future video. Anyways, thanks for watching and thank you so much for 10,000 subscribers. Until next time.